My name is Michael Tillotson, and I am an author. These are my two beautiful books, right here. And if you've read these books, then you probably know that they are not scary. And that's not for lack of trying. Witch of the Starlit Coven here was intended to have two entire chapters that were designed to be sort of horror-esque, but they just wound up not being scary. And these books aren't scary because I can't write scary, and I can't write scary because I don't read, watch, or play scary. Generally speaking, I am not the biggest fan of horror and horror-adjacent genres. It's not so much because I don't like being scared, it's because there's a lot of common tactics that horror media tends to employ that I either can't handle or just really don't like. The two big ones are jump scares and gore. So I have to be kind of picky with what horror media I engage with, because in the case of gore, it can make me physically ill. I don't know if that's just a me thing or if it's something a lot of people experience, but I legitimately cannot do it. But every now and then, I'll pick up a horror video game or two, usually only video games for some reason. I don't really read or watch horror. But anyway, on a whim and with the recommendation of a friend, I decided to pick up a horror video game called Signalis. And I loved it, from its level design to its spooky aesthetics and its very, very trippy storytelling. It was great. I think, though, above all else, there was one thing on a storytelling front that just jumped out at me as, wow, this is really good. And I thought, let's talk about it. Obviously, given the nature of this video, I will be spoiling Signalis' story, so if you haven't played it, I recommend you go do that first, okay? Okay, let's go. When you first start Signalis, and for the majority of the time playing Signalis, you will probably be very, very, very confused. This game is not very direct with its storytelling. I remember once I had this fun idea for a short story where the protagonist was this shapeshifter who could be basically everywhere at once. And this short story was basically just going to be an hour or two from her perspective. It would be rapidly jumping back and forth between all these different scenes, and it was going to be super weird and confusing where it would read the reader like, what's going on here? Signalis doesn't have any sort of omnipresent shape-shifting girl, but even so, I found it made me feel the exact same way, where I felt like I was getting thrown all these disconnected pieces of a story that I could tell made sense if I could just put the pieces together, but it was easier said than done. I didn't really know what was going on for the majority of the game, and far from a complaint, I think this is really fun. The whole time I was just scrambling around trying to get all the pieces together, and there was enough there that I was slowly getting parts of it, but I didn't really get the whole picture until I beat the game. And this final moment where everything just kind of snapped into place was so satisfying. And it's important to note, the game never spells it out. You don't reach the final boss who sits down and gives you a big speech on the lore. You still have to put it all together yourself. And I say all of this basically just as a preface to a disclaimer, that what I'm about to talk about is my interpretation of the story. After I played Signalis, I got one of my buddies to play it, and when they told me their interpretation, it was like we had played two completely different games. So, the big part of Signalis' story that I loved the most was the time loop. Now, I love time loops in general, so there's probably just a little bit of bias here, but it's not that Signalis is the best and most amazingest time loop to ever loop. No, that would be in Stars in Time. But the reason I'm here talking about Signalis' time loop is because there are two things about it that I don't really think I've seen before, at least not a lot, and definitely not together. When you start Signalis, your spaceship crash lands on an icy tundra, and you go and take a look around. You crawl into a hole and find yourself into an office. Totally normal stuff. Happened to me last week. When you're there, you get this weird vision. You see your character start to decay as these words flash on screen over and over and over again. Great holes have been dug where Earth's pores should have sufficed, and things have learned to walk when they ought to crawl. Real spooky stuff. Then, without warning, you find yourself in an abandoned mining facility, and the game starts improper. You're looking for someone, but you don't really know why, but you're fairly certain that if they're still alive, they're near the bottom of this facility, so you keep going down. There's some illness that's been ravaging the place, killing all of the people and turning the androids who run the place into sort of mindless monsters. There's a couple of these androids, called replicas, that are still themselves, but they're few and far between, and one of them kicks you down an elevator anyway. His name is Adler. He's a jerk. There's obviously a lot of things going wrong in this facility, but when you're kicked down this elevator, you get the first glimpse that something is extra wrong here. Because at the bottom of this elevator shaft are a lot of bodies, and not just any bodies. They look exactly like you. That might not seem all that weird at first. You are, after all, a replica, which, as their name implies, there are a lot of other replicas out there that look just like you. But as you get a little further, you learn there's a replica named Colibri, who, before this illness ravaged the facility, got the impression that something weird was going on with Adler, the guy who kicked you down the elevator shaft. And this is the first moment where it might finally click that there's a time loop going on, and like always for some reason, there's someone who's immune to it, but it's not you, it's not the protagonist, it's Adler. And he has a memory that really confused this Colibri who can read minds. She mentions in her notes that there's no Elster unit, the type of replica that you are, in this facility, but Adler has memories of sending one into the mines. There are a few more explicit notes here that Adler is going through a time loop, but if you then remember all those Elster corpses in the elevator, it paints kind of a weird picture. Now, there's a possibility Elster units are just flocking to this facility like flies, and Adler is just luring them all to the elevator shaft for some reason. But if that were the case, you'd think we'd see one or two along the way, and it stuck out to me that these Elster units came from previous time loops. Elsters are flocking here like flies, but only one at a time, over and over and over again in one time loop after another. At this point, my mind is just buzzing with questions. Why is there a time loop? Why is Adler not affected by it? Why is he murdering all these Elster units? Like, what the heck is going on here? And eventually we hit the end of the loop. We find the red gate in the deepest corridor of the mines, and we go through and find ourselves in a red desert. Suddenly, we remember our promise. We find our crashed ship, not in the tundra, but in the desert. We try to open it, we fail, and we die, and the time loop starts again. In this loop, we start on our ship again, but ultimately find ourselves in a city called Rotfront, and like Sierpinski, it's been ravaged by the same sickness. The people are dead, and the replicas attack on sight. There's a lot of fun stuff that happens here. Well, fun. It's a horror game. But as far as the discussion goes, I want to point out one particular thing. As we explore Rotfront, entire buildings get corrupted by the sickness, transforming into horrible masses of flesh, locking us out of previously visited areas. There's a character who we've known to be alive and well, or we've known them to be alive anyway, and not only do we find her grave here, we see her die, even though this grave seems to imply she's already dead. And not only that, but we saw her in Sierpinski, the mining facility, and we're on an entirely different planet now, so she shouldn't really be here to die in the first place. But then again, we shouldn't be here either. Eventually we loop again, only now we're back on Sierpinski. Even though we're fairly certain that at this point we're in a time loop, everything should theoretically be back where it was at the start of the game, but it's not. The place is a wreck. Those fleshy blobs we saw back on Rotfront are all over the place now. Regardless, we make our way back to the Red Gate to find our ship again and fulfill our promise. I left out a lot of details there, so if you haven't played the game and this sounds neat, you should go play it. There's still plenty of stuff I didn't touch on. But let's get back on track here. The thing about Signalis' time loop that I really love is, well, first off, you have no idea it's there for most of the story. This is definitely the more common of the two things I love about it, the classic first loop situation where we see how things will play out normally, except not quite, because this is many, many, many loops in. We know this from the Elster corpses in the elevator. There are hundreds of them. But the other thing I love about this time loop is it's not stable. things from previous loops seem to carry over to more recent ones. The Elster corpses, the severity of the disease, the character who should be dead. This is a really fun idea, I think, because to most of the people going through the loop, these things will just come out of nowhere. The Elster corpses went mostly unnoticed because of the disease, but if the disease wasn't there, one day the elevator shaft would just suddenly be jammed up by all these corpses that came out of nowhere, and this just leaves anyone in the world to go like, what the heck, man? Where did all these bodies come from? And then on top of that, the world itself is degrading. Not only do things from previous loops carry over, creating these wacky paradoxes, but the time loops are the source of this all-encompassing illness. The time loop is the reason everything is becoming this horrid, fleshy mass. Each successive loop is causing the world to steadily destroy itself. And the threat of the world ending isn't anything new, but seeing these things through the eyes of a time looper created a greater sense of urgency and panic than these the world will end threats usually do. And on top of that, the game never really tells you explicitly that the world is going to end, and we never see it end. It's a realization that we come to on our own, and I think that also heightens the panic of the situation. Like, someone sitting me down and telling me, the world is going to end. That doesn't really do much for me, you know? It's just like, oh boy, the plot is setting up its stakes, how exciting. But when I'm witnessing the end of the world firsthand, when nobody tells me it's going to end, but that realization that it is just smacks me in the face, it's so much more of a, oh my stars, the world is going to end, isn't it? Even though the stakes are arguably the same, it makes it feel so much more urgent and personal, and man, I wish this was something I could capture in a book, but it's one of those things that video games are so much more apt for doing. I've never quite seen a time loop like Signalis is, and as much as I love the time loop of In Stars and Time or Wizard with a Gun, the loops themselves in these stories are mostly pretty standard, and the fun part about them is more the world they take place in and the characters who reside there than it is about the loop themselves. Signalis still has that part to it. The world and the characters are really fun and interesting, but the loop itself and the rules it adheres to are interesting too, and that's something you, or at least I, don't really see a lot, and I think it's really cool. But that's all from me. I'll see you in another video.